Now, 50 years ago, on October the 6th, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack against Israeli forces in the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights. It was an attempt to reverse what most Arabs considered a humiliating defeat in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, in which Israeli forces captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria, as well as the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. Despite early successes by Egyptian and Syrian forces, after nearly 3 weeks of fighting and tens of thousands of casualties, Israel's military had made significant gains. Both sides declared victory. Now, the war, amongst other factors, ultimately led to the 1978 Camp David Accords, which saw Israel withdraw from Sinai in return for normalisation of relations. A peace treaty signed a year later marked the first time that an Arab nation had recognised Israel. Hoda Abdel-Hamid reports.
1400 hours, Saturday, 6th of October 1973, the 10th day of Ramadan. The holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. Operation Badr started. Egypt and Syria launched a two-pronged attack on Israel to liberate the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. In the first few hours, Egyptian tanks overran the Bar-Lev line, Israel's heavily fortified line of defense in occupied Sinai, with overwhelming firepower from the ground and the air. Egypt wanted a limited war, but one that would restore national dignity after the defeat of the Six-Day War in 1967.
There was a devastating feeling of the crisis and defeat then. There was tension, there was disorder, including demonstrations and the occupation of Tahrir Square. Everyone wanted to fight back. The regime was accused of failure, and in fact, Sadat was heavily criticized.
The Israelis were taken by surprise despite early warnings. But after 3 days of fighting, the Egyptian army was halted by Israel's counter-offensive. The war came to a stalemate. But Egypt's bold offensive sent shockwaves around the world and led to a global oil crisis. In New York, the UN Security Council adopted 3 UN resolutions before a ceasefire was reached. By then, Israeli tanks had pushed the Syrian army, and while Egypt maintained territorial gains, a successful counterattack encircled part of the Egyptian army. At 1852, on October 22nd, the war stopped. Israel was traumatized by its military failure, and an opportunity for peace had risen from the ashes. 5 years later, Egypt's Anwar el-Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords, the first peace treaty between the Jewish state and an Arab country.
The major heritage, if you want, of the war is the Israeli understanding that giving up the whole of Sinai, up to the last inch, to the Egyptian in exchange for peace was better than keeping the Sinai without peace.
While Egypt regained full control of Sinai, the deal angered the Arab world and left a sense of betrayal among Palestinians.
That was the most important blow to the Palestinian issue and cause. Neutralizing Egypt from the conflict, that's it. After that, for the Palestinian cause, it never kicked back.
Sadat was assassinated on October 6, 1981, during a victory parade to celebrate the military success of Operation Badr. But the seed of normalization was sown. Over the next decades, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, and a few other Arab countries made their own peace agreements. Saudi might follow suit, but prospects of a Palestinian state remain as elusive as ever. Hoda Abdel-Hamid, Al Jazeera.
Nabil Fahmy is Egypt's former foreign minister and joins us live now from Cairo. Mr. Fahmy, good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. You were at college at the time of the conflict, and your father was then Egypt's foreign minister. What do you remember about the moment you heard that the attack was underway?
Great question. Let me take you one step further back. 1967, I was in high school. When that war broke out with the horrible consequences and result, Egyptians, including myself, lost complete hope for the future and were completely depressed about what options we had looking forward. 1973 was the exact opposite. I was my last year in college. We heard of the outbreak of military actions. In all candidness, we hesitated for a second to see whether we're going to believe this or not. And then once it was concrete evidence that our soldiers had crossed the Suez Canal, Egyptians regained their confidence. They became ready once again, or more ready to fight. They became more ready to negotiate, and Arabs and the Egyptians joined together. But let me add another point. The October War was a very well calculated paradigm changer at the global level. It made Arabs believe in themselves. It made Israelis stop believing in their invincibility. It made the Americans and the Soviets believe that they can't ignore the Middle East. And it started a negotiating process that, needless to say, took time. So for us, it was a major change.
Mr. Fahmy, I'm going to get to that, actually, because obviously your father was in the middle of all of those negotiations. How significant was the decision, really, by President Sadat, really, to go to war, knowing, as you say, that the US and the Soviets weren't really interested in Middle East peace, and Israel was buoyant after the success of 1967, and it sort of left Arabs in a sort of no man's zone, wondering where we go next. As you say, the perception was increased or certainly bettered by this offensive. Was it the right decision?
Definitely. Before the war, discussions between the late President Sadat, who should be given credit for his courage and wisdom in going to war, and discussions with my father, the essence was Egypt had to change direction. Egypt had to be more proactive and had to be more towards the center of the world. The first steps Sadat took was sending his national security advisor to see the Americans in Paris and in New York. And Dr. Kissinger, at the time, basically ignored the messages, responding that, I can't help you before you help yourself. And his focus was on US-Soviet détente. When those messages came back, Sadat understood that I have to move the process from the region. So he laid out two initiatives, one very clear one, which was if the Israelis withdraw 50 kilometers to the east from the canal, I will open it up for civilian navigation. Because he wanted to negotiate. He did not want to go to war. But the Israelis, living in a stupor of invincibility, felt that they didn't have to react to that. So he went to war with a calculated goal of, I want to go to war to negotiate.
So
he achieved his purpose.
Mr. Fahmy, let me bring in Henry Kissinger. You know, for our viewers who perhaps were far too young to remember him, he was the Secretary of State for the US. And as you say, he wanted to keep, you might say, the status quo the same because perhaps there wasn't any reason to try and find a long-term peace. The status quo was roughly pretty stable at the time, but there were distractions in the American administration. Watergate was ongoing. There was this Cold War between the US and the then Soviet Union. And the perception then was that nothing needed to be done. How wrong was Kissinger when it came to assessing what Sadat's real goals were for what he believed would be a long-term peace for the Middle East, but it hasn't quite turned out like that?
Well, the proof is in the pudding. The Americans and the Soviets were reactive rather than proactive. They didn't support the war. They didn't initially support the negotiations either. And then when they did, they wanted containment. They did not want resolution because they wanted to deal with each other. But the Egyptians, and ultimately the Arabs, and of course, on the other side of this debate were the Israelis, ultimately were telling the world, well, if you're not going to engage in this, we will. The Arab side took the initiative, And the Israelis had to respond and to understand that, well, you cannot live in continuing occupation of other territory and assume you're going to have peace and security. So this is a lesson to be drawn. One, take advantage of major powers, but don't depend on them excessively. Secondly, major powers need to understand that regional players will ultimately be the paradigm shifters in different regions.
Indeed, an interesting time in history and one that we'll continue to analyse here on Al Jazeera through the day. But for the moment, Nabil Fahmy, former Foreign Minister of Egypt, thank you very much for your time, sir.